I've been really excited about this particular book club because I've been following Margaret's work for years and years. And if anybody here is a heretic and haven't seen her YouTube on Super Chickens, you have to do that as well as read the book, by the way, because actually, Margaret, that sort of shifted my way of thinking about teams quite substantially. So thank you. But we're here to talk about the book, the most recent book, Uncharted. We will hopefully cover a bunch of other things that you are interested in and we're interested in. By introduction, Margaret, you're a business person, you're advising execs, you're a professor at Bath, and prolific writer. So we'll dig into this book. First, I can see lots of people coming in, it's flicking through my screen all the time, so I'm a little bit distracted. Which is, what does this book say? So the people who haven't had a chance to read it, will you just outline roughly what's the message that you put through? Thank you.
Sure. So the book is really in two parts. The first part asks the question, how much in life can we predict? And I think it makes a reasonably coherent argument in saying very, very, very little. And so the first, so that first bit is about how economic prediction, how and why it fails, the failure of models and the numbers on which models are based. It looks at how and why history does not, in fact, repeat itself. And it looks at systems like genetics and why they don't provide some spectacular insight into our future. And then it essentially says, okay, so if we really can't see very far into the future with any degree of accuracy, what do we do? And how do we create the future, anticipate the future, think about the future? And it looks at experimentation, scenario planning. It looks at extremely long-term thinking, which I think about in terms of cathedral projects, so projects that last longer than a human lifetime. It looks at existential crises and how we handle those. It looks at how artists manage to do work that lasts for very long periods of time, but didn't plan that that is what they would do. And it looks at the one certainty that we can be confident of, which is our own death, and how should we think about that? And then it looks at the nature of preparedness. If you can't plan, you can prepare. What does that mean? What advantages does it give us? And what does it mean when you put all these things together in terms of both our individual, private, personal lives and the lives of organizations, institutions, and countries? So just a light topic.
Just a little bit, and it seems really of the moment, right? So I've been talking a lot about how, any leader who says that they're certain of anything now is clearly lying. But before we get to that, the one thing that struck me about the book is how diverse it is, how the examples you've got, Eleanor McGuire and Julia's children, Joe and Luca, and those very personal stories. And then you've got the health services, the military companies. How do you set about when you're, where's the idea come from? And how do you think, well, what am I going to filter into this?
Yeah, it comes about in a pretty chaotic way. I probably have an idea for a book almost every day. And the way I deal with that is I see which ones leave me alone, which ones do I just forget about. And certain ones just won't leave me alone, and this one definitely would not. And it really started from two observations. One was the observation made by professional students of forecasting, that probably the window for accurate forecasting, if you're a super rigorous, consult a very broad diversity of sources, constantly adjust your forecast in the light of new and emerging information, establish probabilities for your forecast, and then always check, how right were you, how wrong were you. Probably the furthest out you can see with any degree of accuracy is 400 days. Well, that really stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah.
And then it gets worse, right? If you aren't that rigorous, and most of us aren't, I'm not, probably the most accurate you can be is about 150 days out. And this was one of these nerdy data points that sat in my head. And I kept thinking, wow, this changes everything. I mean, forever we've managed companies with sort of 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plans. We're addicted to planning. We believe in it. This, forecast, plan, execute is a sort of 3-legged stool on which all organizational life rests. Wow, this is a big deal. Why is everybody not screaming about this? So it stuck in my head for that reason. And also, I just kept having conversations with people that persuaded me that the way they thought about the future was really wonky. So people would ask me, what's going to happen about the Brexit referendum? Well, how would I know? I mean, why me, And people asked me about the Trump election. And as people kept asking me these questions, I thought, in their heads, the future exists behind a locked door, and they think some special people have the key. And A, there are no such special people. But B, it isn't on the other side of the door. The future hasn't happened yet. So it is, by definition, unknowable. And then I thought, about, Delphic oracles and, reading the entrails of eagles and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, well, actually, a huge amount of certainly Western history has been driven by the development of dogmas which purport to tell us the future, because this uncertainty about it is obviously so upsetting to us. But none of them is true. So if they're not, what should we be doing? And I thought that was a really interesting question. And I wanted to understand all the aspects of it differently and better. So then, where do I start? Well, a lot of what I do is I start thinking about, okay, what are the buckets into which this falls? I do a kind of brain dump. What is that for myself? What is everything I think I know about this? And what do those cluster around particular themes? I start listening differently. This always happens. Now I become obsessed. I become a hammer. Everything in life is a nail. Every conversation, there's something in there.
And was that on the concept of uncertainty, or and how we deal with being uncertain, or the future? When you look at it,
it was to do with uncertainty, and it was to do with the future, and it was to do with complexity. And it started to become around narrative and narrative fallacy. This notion that if a story feels true, it must be true. And so lots of stuff starts to feed into it. And then and sometimes I'm lucky to have very random conversations with amazing people. So I remember having a conversation with Eliza Manningham Buller, who ran MI5 and the Wellcome Trust. And she just happened to drop into the conversation, I think, as I was walking out the door, that they were in the process of funding a thing called the Center for Epidemic Preparedness. And the idea of preparedness absolutely sort of stuck in my head like a burr. So I started tracking down what that was and why that was. And that was a very big part of my thing. So I nose around, I wallow around. It's a very incoherent research process, but one thing always leads to another. And then at some point, which is absolutely unpredictable, and it's always later than my husband thinks, I think, okay, I think I can start now. I mean, I also read lots of books. I read lots and lots and lots of books about the history of forecasting as an industry. Yes. And some of the founding fathers of forecasting, which is, the chapter that opens the book.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And yeah, because that diversity, I think, for me, made the book more interesting and kind of more believable, that you can take it from the personal all the way up to how shell scenario planning that you go into and so on.
It drives my publishers nuts because they want books that sit inside categories. Yes. And business books in particular that, still have there's an expectation that they'll have a prescription in them. And people get very annoyed with me that I generally don't provide those. I give people lots and lots and lots of ideas on the assumption that they'll take the stuff that makes sense to them. But I don't believe in recipes, except for cooking.
Yeah, and baking, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, that makes sense. And actually, it is one of the questions that often we talk about in this book club is, what are the actions? What would you like people to do with this?
Right.
And not and it's interesting you say, not a recipe. There was lots of things, and I think actually a lot of my post-it notes are about, where could this go, and where could that go? And do you mainly, so you read about future forecasting, do you go into, I can see John has asked it, science fiction? Do you go that direction as well, or do you stick with topics and nonfiction?
I read a little bit about science fiction, and I read some science fiction. It's important that, most of what are considered to be serious science fiction writers do not think they're in the prediction industry. And many will say, well, actually, their books are full of so many predictions. Sure, some of them are bound to come true, but they really don't regard themselves as being in the prediction industry. And I think that's quite interesting, because they're really trying to do other things in them. I'm not myself a big reader of science fiction. My husband absolutely is. So we had a lot of really interesting conversations about that. But predicting the future isn't what they do. What they are doing, which is really interesting, is asking questions. Well, what if this and what if that? How would the consequences of this flow? And that, I think, is intriguing. But they certainly, the most highly regarded of them, are not there to provide answers.
So I think about interesting questions. Kind of back to, you mentioned this sort of how unsettling uncertainty is for us as human beings. And as far as I can see, the whole system we've created, and we talk a lot about systems changes needed and so on, and we need to move from linear and reductionist to more living complex systems. That seems to be, the problem with that move is uncertainty, right? Because that's how we've built up our system.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think there's any way of overcoming that on a systems level, if we take it from all the way up there without a prescription? But where should we dig in first?
I mean, it's interesting. When I wrote the book, I think I was a little intolerant of uncertainty, in the sense that I felt that, and I still feel this to a degree, that their need for certainty led them to accept really second-rate ideas and second-rate solutions. And so I was rather intolerant, I think, of their discomfort. And I thought, and I do still believe, that uncertainty is can be a very, very fruitful place or a space. But I also feel, having lived through a year of uncertainty, which for me has been really pretty easy, I think I have a lot more compassion for people for whom this has been excruciating. It's clearly excruciating if someone you love is in hospital and you can't visit them, and nobody can tell you, because they do not know whether they will survive COVID. Of course, that's excruciating.
Yeah.
On an apparently lighter note, it is excruciating if you're a young person a year or two out of university and you want to plan a career, not knowing if you can, not being able to plan or schedule anything, not knowing where to live, not knowing necessarily which of your friends will still be friends, not knowing how to occupy the time, whether to make a career change or not. I mean, I think for the younger generation who have not been medically so threatened, I think the uncertainty of what employment and meaningful work and community look like at the other end of this is just unspeakably painful. And so I have a great deal more compassion for discomfort with uncertainty than I think I did when I wrote the book, because, you know, I've had 3 really successful, fabulously rewarding and satisfying careers. It's easy for me to be pretty comfortable with uncertainty. I have lots of options and resources. That isn't true for a very large number of people for whom this crisis has shattered what little certainty they had.
Now, yeah, I want to ask you, what do you think we should do? I tend to jump quite quickly to action personally, but and I agree with you that what we've seen from young people, and when we had a little briefing session, we talked about this idea of should a certain age group retire early in order to make space in the system for young people coming in. What else do you think we can do to help, particularly, you know, so a generation or a group of people who are really suffering from that, as you say, out of university by a year or two, or maybe just out of university last summer, having finished online?
Hire them and make them feel they matter. I mean, that is the single most important thing any employer can do. Employ people, pay attention to them, make them feel they matter. That's it. That's a gigantic gift. And, you know, of course, one hopes that there's self-interest in there, because then you really do matter. It's not just kindness. I mean, I do feel quite strongly that many people who, and this is going to sound harsh, but we're in a harsh time. Many people who could retire should retire. You know, if we have a generation of young people who can't get started, they can't earn money, they can't grow up. Literally, they cannot grow up. This is terrible for them. It's terrible human waste, and it's terrible for us as a society. So I think, you know, I think it's time for the grown-ups to make some sacrifices here. I feel it quite strongly. And sacrifices in terms of jobs, in terms of pay, in terms of mentoring young people, in terms of promoting them maybe a little earlier than is necessary, but giving them the support they need. I mean, we really have a whole generation of people who need to feel hopeful. And they know better than we do, let's be honest. It isn't just about employment. It's also about inequality, and it's also about a climate crisis, the worst of which they will inherit. And they will inherit it because of our negligence and willful blindness. So we have got to do this.
Yeah, no, and actually I can see Tracy's already jumped into the chat, so I'm going to jump to her just on this topic about, you know, when you say retire, is it not potentially more useful to use that experience in a sort of halfway house of mentoring?
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, and I mentor a number of chief executives, and I really love doing the work. But I'm not a chief executive anymore. So yes, I think that's absolutely an excellent thing to do. But I do think we have to get out of people's way. You know, we have a very, very blocked pipeline, crammed full of imaginative, eager, creative, ambitious, in the right way, young people. And we've got to give them some headroom to grow.
No, it is interesting, isn't it? I was looking at the bonuses paid out to CEOs in the last year, and you think, well, a little bit of that down the chain would make a huge difference, also to the economy.
I mean, there are two problems with this, right? That money doesn't enter the economy because nobody can spend enough. So we know trickle down doesn't work. We know it doesn't work because there was an error in the formula. We also know it doesn't work because the rich can't spend enough. Or as Paul Pullman said to me once, we don't need more billionaires. More billionaires don't add anything to the economy. We need people in jobs who are healthier anyway, growing and developing, and that's how society grows and develops. We can't afford to have millions of young people just stopped in their tracks.
Wonderful. No, agreed. Well, we may come back to that because, as you know, it's one of my kind of passions around how do we do this. Jumping a little bit through some of the themes in the book, I thought there's two that I want to pick up on first, I guess. One is around the technology. I think it starts with the GPS story, but then expands into what tech does to us in this uncertain world. And I wanted to chat through that because most people would say, well, this is an improvement. We can do things we couldn't, do. And you're pretty balanced, I think, in the book around it. But I just want to push a little bit on this to say, so should we, switch off if you have it, a GPS? Should we not look at our phones for Google Maps? How, and further on, what are the things we should give up and to reap the benefits?
Yeah.
Do you think?
I think a couple of things. I think, first of all, we have to understand that a great deal of the technology that we use today is designed to be addictive in exactly the same way that games are. And when we need to understand that, and therefore to say to ourselves when we choose to adopt them, how am I going to use this wisely? In exactly the same way that, after we've had this conversation, I'm going to have a gin and tonic. I'm not going to have 10, right?
Yes.
My phone is quite helpful, but I don't actually want to spend hours and hours and hours of my life on it. I am very comfortable to give up knowing my children's phone numbers, which I don't know anymore. My phone knows it. I've outsourced that to my phone. I'm very happy to do that. I don't feel it's a great loss in my quality of life. I think it is a very great loss in my quality of life, not seeing people face to face, even though I can, in better times I can.
Yeah.
I think it is a loss in my quality of life to feel that the only way to have, let's say, a great holiday in Barcelona is to research everywhere to stay and choose, ostensibly the best and the best sites and the best walks and the best restaurants and the best flights, and therefore, predict my experience of Barcelona before I've had it, which is essentially what all of these tools let us do. I think it is a loss in the quality of life if I no longer feel comfortable in a new town, just wandering around. And I notice that this is how people feel, that, that they can't go out and wander around and find somewhere to eat. They've got to research it and book it. They can't wander into a church if it's not on the list of the 10 most important sites in Barcelona. That they are, because there's this tremendous capacity to kind of predict the experience and create it before you have it.
Yeah.
We're kind of losing both our nerve and our imagination to simply let these places happen to us. And on a kind of less kind of rigid scale, I would say, in the pandemic, I've been cycling a lot, and it's pretty hard. Well, it's not hard, actually. Technology could solve this problem for me. I was going to say it's quite hard to read a map and bike at the same time.
Yes.
So I could get a little holder for my phone and put that on my handlebars and kind of, it's not terribly safe actually, but it would probably be okay. But actually, I don't want to do that, because what I want to do is wander and see what I want, what's there. And quite often, I have to admit, I get lost. And getting lost is really interesting. You pay attention to everything. And you realize you're lost because you've passed the same church 3 times, right?
Yes.
This is from a creative perspective, this is a very, very, very rich experience. I'm noticing things I never noticed or bothered to notice if I was reading the map. And it's not just that I'm looking at my phone, not at the road. It's also that I'm thinking more about the destination than the process of getting there. So this kind of our inundation by tools that try to take unpredictability out of life, I think both shrink our imagination and they make us very fearful of life and very unconfident in our own capacity to deal with what we come across. And that loss, I mind a very great deal.
Yeah. So there's actually an inherent quality, as you say, in discovery, in the getting lost and not feeling fear. Presumably because if you've got lost a few times somewhere, I remember getting lost in Venice once, which was really, really lost. But once you've done that, then not many other little European cities hit me as sort of scary for being lost. So it's that, and there's something inherent, the quality in that, and in imagination, and linked to imagination, which you talk quite a lot about, I guess, or at least that's what I took as a really important, not tool, but quality, both in humans and in leaders as we go forward.
And it's absolutely crucial. And I think there are a whole bunch of themes here. One is, I mean, I get approached by very many companies asking me, can I help their people to become more creative? And invariably, the place I start is saying, okay, so what are you doing that's stopping them? Everybody's born creative. Everybody's born with imagination. So what is it about the working conditions here that is stopping that? And that's around goals and targets and KPIs. It may be about working too many hours. It may be about typecasting people so that they're always given the same kind of problem. It may be about silos. It may be about no time for experimentation. So, my first prescription is just get rid of as much of that stuff as you possibly can. So it's a little bit like a detox, right? Just get all the bollards out of the road and then see what you got. So it's partly that. Of course, what happens is, because leaders want predictability, and especially in publicly traded companies, they want to be able to tell the market what to expect. The imagination scares the living daylights out of them. And so they create organizations in which experimentation is only seen as risk, not opportunity, where exploration is seen as inefficient. And so they create cultures in which imagination cannot thrive, where they will not ask a question that can't immediately be answered, and they cannot conceive of a question that sits across disciplines. And I think increasingly, and much more so than when I wrote the book, I think this is actually becoming a crisis now, in the sense that I have sat in rooms of very senior executives, leaders of very big, important companies, who can see that we're coming out of a pandemic into an economic crisis that we do not understand. Nobody knows how to manage the economy in the state it currently is. We do not, they also recognize that this has a gigantic social cost, which nobody fully understands how to rectify. And in terms of thinking how on earth you completely redesign an economy for the climate crisis, well, that's just way beyond everybody. You know, scope 1, maybe, scope 2, scope 3.
Scope 3, we're gone.
Idea.
Yeah.
And they are literally paralyzed. They cannot think about it. Now, I'm not for a moment saying this is easy. I am saying to get started, you need imagination. And I have not been in a room where senior leaders felt they had, either in themselves or in their people, the imaginative capacity to start thinking this through. Now, this is a huge problem.
Yeah.
This is their job. And we all need people who can think this through. Now, you know, here in the UK, I think this is painfully obvious, which is we have some urgency about getting, you know, the pandemic over with, but there's no concept of what lies after it. You know, they're vague promises, none of which are internally or externally consistent. And if you want to give people hope, it's about having some imagined better country.
Future, yeah.
And nobody I have seen in any party has come up with anything that might resemble a vision. Now, this is an imaginative failure of a really frightening order, I think.
No, agreed. And do you think that is partly kind of rooted in, so either inability or out of practice, right? Because some of this is about practice and habits of being imaginative and tapping into that creative. But the other could be this idea that you shouldn't say anything if you're not certain about it. So it's back again to, you know, if you had a leader of a party saying, well, this is what, you know, could be, and then it doesn't happen, are the consequences of being wrong just have flipped so much, almost like in those organizations that we both know, where you don't do anything unless you can predict it, and you'd rather be less ambitious.
Well, I think you make a very good point, which is the fear of failure is itself very paralyzing. And in many societies, the punishment for failure is pretty extreme. Certainly in the UK, I think the love of punishment for people who appear to fail is pretty nasty. We deride people who fail. Although it's really interesting, I made a program for Radio 4 that went out last Sunday for analysis about decision making. And a number of, you know, important heavy lifting business people, business thinkers and politicians talking about this. And there's no doubt in anybody's mind that everybody learns from mistakes. And that actually, you know, mistakes are fonts of wisdom. But we say that.
And yet we're not willing, yes.
Yeah, and you can take somebody like Martin Gilbert, you know, whose firm, Aberdeen Asset Management, just about collapsed because of a big mistake that they made. And he now, I mean, he commands a lot of respect. And the reason is because after the firm had made this terrible mistake, he moved heaven and earth for years and years and years to rescue and redeem his company, which he did successfully. His reputation is based not so much on the mistake as his ability to learn from it. But if we won't let people make mistakes, they're never going to learn anything, because they're just going to be recycling the extremely narrow basket of ideas that they have. And I would say that, you know, one of the things we're seeing in our political life and indeed in our economic life is a paucity of new thinking.
Yeah, no, and just kind of zooming that back down to, we talked a little bit about young people. If we go a stage younger, so I'm around quite a few young people who are in the sort of exam stages, and they are saying, well, we can't afford to make one mistake because it will determine our whole life.
Yeah.
And that's the feeling. I can see Elodie's put something in about the educational system, but that fear of failure is rooted really young. If you've been chosen not to be able to, whether it's get into school or a university or a graduate scheme or whatever it is, because of one bad day or one exam paper or several for that matter.
Right.
Um,
So I think that's right. I mean, it's fair to say that there are schools that run things called failure weeks, right? Where you get higher marks if you make a bigger mistake, right? And they're very designed to get people comfortable with risk and with, having slightly wilder ideas.
yes.
And to see failure as learning. And I think they're fantastic. I think they're a really brilliant thing. But I think, one of the things that we really do badly here is we make people limit what they study way, way, way too early. And we do have a system obsessed with testing, designed by people who clearly loved tests because they aced them, and have no empathy for people, who did not have their similarly trainable minds. And definitely that has two consequences. One is, exactly as you say, is a fear of making mistakes. And the other is, I think it absolutely kills off curiosity. So I remember a BBC correspondent telling me how, he had covered the second Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
No, sorry, the first Iraq War. And his son was studying it at school, and he started telling him about it. And his son just cut him off and said, "Dad, we don't need to know any of that in the test."
Yeah.
Well, so here's somebody who has phenomenal, fantastic, interesting firsthand experience, but the kid has no time for it. And, I remember years ago, I was asked by a private equity company to come and talk to them about the importance of curiosity. And I was absolutely kind of amazed at, like, why would you? I mean, it's an interesting, commission.
Yeah.
But why do they need somebody to proselytize curiosity? Well, because everybody was like this, right?
Yeah.
It's about the rate of return. It's about the rate of return, predictable rate of return. So I'm not going to look left or right. So I think, our desire to be able to nail stuff down early, not let anything move or change in order to make the world predictable, is predictably destructive of some of the most important of human skills. Curiosity, imagination, learning from mistakes, the courage to try something that is new, experimentation, the good questions that provoke conflict. All of these things are what allowed us to invent phenomenal things, to get people out of hunger and poverty, to build all sorts of astonishing things. All human achievement resides on those things, which we now, in pursuit of maximum efficiency and pinpoint forecasting, are eliminating. And I think that would be bad enough as it is, right? But to do so in an age where we don't know what's coming next, where we don't know what skills and capacity we need, is nothing short of criminal. Because if you don't know what you need, you pack everything, right? Yeah. If I don't know what the weather's going to be when, if I ever get to go on holiday, then, I'm going to pack my winter clothes and my summer clothes and 57 pairs of shoes just in case. But we are not doing that with the cultivation of human capital. We are putting in, one pair of shoes, one pair of socks, one outfit, and saying, well, we think you look really good in that. We can predict that wherever you go, you'll make an impression.
You might freeze to death.
You might freeze to death. No,
exactly.
Pneumonia, whatever.
Yeah, but you'll look great. So to Elodie's question about do we need to change the education system, we do, right? Because I've seen those. There are more and more courses and failure weeks and find your strength weeks. But really, if it comes down to, you need that grade, and are you going to be tested on that? It will provoke a very different response to, oh yeah, I know that failure is good, but I'm not about to fail this test. Thank you very much. I need to just nail it.
I think that's right. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for educationalists, because education always the cause of all our woes and the solution to all our woes, which is a really tricky spot to be in. But I think certainly in the UK, we have really energetically gone backwards. And I say that partly because, the last big book I wrote, which was a bigger prize, I looked at education and how the consequences of making it so competitive. And in the course of my research, I went to Singapore and I interviewed the Minister for Education there, Lawrence Wong at the time. And he was really interesting because, of course, the Singapore education system has been, widely celebrated and always, got great marks on all sorts of international comparisons. And he said, we are proud of our education system. It has been very competitive. And we think it has really done wonders for our very young country to get us from nowhere to somewhere in 50 years. It's achieved a lot for us. But we also know, and we started thinking a few years ago, that it won't be fit for the next 50 years, that we need more imagination, more creativity, more collaboration. So we started to go around the world and see where we could find kind of best practice in this regard. And especially we went to the US and the UK. And we were absolutely horrified to discover they were copying us.
Yeah, I remember.
But we know that what we've got isn't fit for the future. And so they started, very carefully, very thoughtfully, taking some of the competitive stuff, taking a lot of the rigidity out of their educational system, making education more collaborative, more about teamwork, more multidisciplinary, slowly but surely, because they said, we don't want the best 20th century education system in the world. We want the best 21st century education in the world. And if nobody knows what that is, then we're going to find out.
Which is fantastic, isn't it? We're doing a little bit of work at the moment with Shizenkan University in Japan, where they've created an MBA or business school for the 22nd century is what they're aiming at. Yes, you would love it, actually. They're trying to balance out some of the sort of what they're saying, the Asian values and culture, and whether it's the yin or the yang. So they're seeing the Western side of business schools and that type of education as one side, but with this piece missing. So really, that would be
the other thing I think that's really important is that when we talk about education, we tend to think about it in terms of institutions. And I think increasingly that's wrong. That, the thing we've absolutely got to have is lifelong learning. And I would say, having, lived and worked in America for nearly 9 years, and that it's phenomenal the degree to which people keep being educated there. And obviously I'm talking about people who have the freedom and resources to do this.
To do it.
But that where at any point, if you decide, actually, I don't want to be a stockbroker, I want to be a psychiatrist, it's pretty easy to do that. I mean, it's not always cheap and it can take a long time. But anything you feel, or if you're in a job and you think, actually, I could do this job much better if I just knew something about economics or art history or whatever, the provision of night schools and the provision of nighttime education by many, many universities is astonishing. And what's really sort of disheartening here in the UK, I think, is the UK invented this all-time brilliant institution called the Open University. And it is a phenomenal prototype of what we should be offering on a much wider scale to everyone in the country, or in fact, to anybody in the world. And, it's so typical of the British to invent something bloody brilliant, like the BBC,
and then get bored with it,
or the Open University, and then just kind of dismiss it, when actually it's the envy of the world and it is an absolute crown jewel, and we should be doing much more with it. Everybody in universities was all aflutter because, oh my God, how are we going to teach online? The Open University has been doing this for decades. How can we work remotely? They've been doing it for decades, and we have this sitting here and it's like everybody's pretended it doesn't exist. It's such a waste.
Really interesting. Thank you. There's so much more I could talk to about that, but I'm going to go to, because I can see the questions building up. So Stephen Tumman says, with more prediction, do we raise our level of expectations for the future? Do these higher levels of expectation, are we then more likely to be let down when the future arrives? Is that the...
Well, I'm not sure all prediction is necessarily, a grander, more glorious future. One of the things that really propelled me to write the book was this a report by a couple of academics at the Oxford Martin School, talking about the loss of, I think it was 48% of jobs, 48 or 47% of jobs by 2035. And I remember thinking, what? And, and I downloaded the paper and read it. And to be fair to the guys who wrote it, in the very first sentence, it says, we are pioneering a new form of modeling, which is a way of saying the methodology is totally untested.
Yeah.
But those very gritty numbers went around the world for years. I have sat in big conferences where they were produced over and over and over again as fact. So now you can argue about, well, why did people gravitate to them? It was obviously there was something about it that made them very compelling. Some of it was, if you say 47%, that looks mighty precise. And it was clearly that people who were absorbing those numbers didn't know how to think about forecasts. But I think a lot of the predictions that we hear, driverless cars by 2017. Oops, so we meant 18. Oops, so we meant 19.
25.
Oops, we meant sometime in the future. This is just all salesmanship and propaganda. I mean, Silly Valley has been at this forever. They always will be. It's how you sell something you can't see yet. But it's also, let's be clear, it's also a propaganda war that's designed to soften up legislation and legislators so that nothing like democracy could possibly get in the way. So I think we have to get very, very, very skeptical and critical when we come across stuff like this. So I don't think necessarily that prediction is kind of raising our sights and we're being disappointed in case you really were hoping for a driverless car. I think what they're trying to do is persuade us to sleepwalk into a future that other people want to make, ostensibly on our behalf, but in which we have no say.
That's quite a scary notion. I think you're right, but
Shoshana Zuboff's book, which is so big, sadly, that most people haven't read it, but it has amassed the most spectacular bunch of interviews with people clearly wanting to impress her and therefore very unguardedly talking about, yes, we've realized we can't actually predict consumer behavior. So if we can't predict it, what we have to do is force it down the paths we want it to go. And if we can't predict from the data, but we can nudge people down the paths that are more profitable for us. So this is a really interesting sort of sleight of hand, which is, well, we can't really predict, so we'll make people do something, and then we'll say we predicted it, and then we'll prove, well, you see, we could predict what you wanted. I mean, you even have this absurdity of Amazon patenting a predictive shopping algorithm, which means they are going to, the capacity to deliver to my house the things they know I want, to save me the effort of thinking about it for myself. This is a registered patent. I'm not keen on outsourcing my thinking very much, not even at the Manal level of thinking about shopping. But of course, what's the game here? Of course, the first couple of things, if they're not quite right, you can keep them for free. And then, of course, you always could return them, but it's such a fast. And then you just become literally a totally passive consumer of whatever it is Amazon wants to sell you. So this, this is using prediction to try to grind down or erode our sense of agency. And I think that is pretty scary. And, if you have people addicted to, tablets and phones and stuff, then the sense of agency already is quite significantly eroded, as are, just watching whatever Netflix serves you next. So I think this is a really serious issue. And originally I thought it was a little paranoid, and I no longer think it's even remotely paranoid. It's very clear to me, this is a business model.
Yes, no, it definitely is. So look, I just got served my gin and tonic. That's a bit early. Yeah, no, it is really interesting, and I was surprised when, and I now can't remember the name of the fairly recent documentary around sort of Facebook and social media. Can anybody remember that in the chat if you can? But I was Social Dilemma. Thank you, Stephen. I was kind of shocked because it had me kind of switch off more things than I had previously. But so many people said to me, and especially young people said, well, yeah, I know it, but I don't really mind being, giving my data and being somewhat manipulated. And I thought that was a really interesting approach to this. Now I'm seeing that Tracy's put up something that people are saying, yes, I have the same question. So we'll just jump there first. It said, isn't this a symptom of what you're discussing? Having AI screening of job applicants, which seems to have become quite common, which is based on achieving pre-specified goals with no ability to evaluate non-standard inputs, e.g. the guy who got a third in economics, but whose final year dissertation started a new department at Goldman Sachs. How do you reverse that automation of human capital, particularly when younger people can't get on the ladder?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question. I think that the answer to it's quite complex. I think there are a couple of things. I think it's really great news that people now have a much better understanding than they did before, that all of this software is deeply biased. It can't not be. You can talk about whether it's, biased the way you like it or the way you don't like it. But, the kind of software he's talking about is basically taking a whole gigantic mound of, here are the people that we hired in the past. We want more people like that. Shove all the CVs down it. It's a kind of matching algorithm. So we got more people like the people we used to have. The problem with that is if you're in a tech company, most of those people are going to be male because we didn't have any women. This is a problem which Amazon worked on for years and could not get rid of. Right. So they gave up on the problem. So it's not an easy problem. You also have software, for example, that just somehow, and whether or not this is by intent or accident, kicks out anybody who shows any sign of having had mental illness, even though in America, where this stuff is used, you could not do that. Could not ask somebody if they had any experience of mental illness. That would be against the law. So we have software doing things that are against the law. We also have software systems which kind of start to develop, if you like, aberrant patterns and behaviors. And we don't know why. So we're seeing decisions that can't be explained. Well, the decision that can't be explained is a bad decision. And there was this extraordinary situation in New York, which went on for nearly a decade, where they were using software to decide which teachers got promoted and which ones got fired. And you saw teachers getting fired for failing to make progress with classes they weren't even teaching. You saw teachers getting fired who were among the most beloved teachers by students and parents. You saw, all sorts of things. And all these good teachers who were being fired, nobody could tell them why they were being fired. So we have lots of those systems out there, and it's important that we know about that. Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, is excellent. Yeah. Virginia Eubank's book, Automating Inequality, is dazzling. And this stuff is really dangerous. And the good thing is there are a lot more people out there who are auditing them, and a lot better protocols being widely shared about how to test them. And the key question here is, for whom do these systems fail? Because if they fail for the kinds of people you particularly want, or if they fail for one particular group, then you shouldn't use them. If they produce decisions that you can't explain, you shouldn't use them. Right?
Yeah.
And you know, it's taken a while for people to realize what a menace this is. I think it's great that ethicists and ethical committees and so on are piling in to deal with them. But I think, I mean, I interviewed Kathy O'Neill, and she said, I think this is exactly right. She said, outsourcing to an algorithm is really avoiding a conversation you don't want to have. You know,
Yep.
I don't want to have the conversation about what kinds of people do we want. I don't want to have the conversation about why I'm firing you. So I'm just going to say the algorithm did it. We have to have the conversations. In terms of, you know, job applications and so on, I think there's a philosophical error in here, which is the assumption that grades predict anything.
Yeah.
Grades are highly predictive of academic grades are highly predictive of academic careers. That's all. They don't predict outcomes in life. They don't predict high achievement or low achievement in any walks of life. And neither, please note, do all of these nonsensical psychographic tests, which don't have statistical validity, like Myers-Briggs, like Gallup Strength Finder, all this mumbo jumbo. So, you know, so I think there's a point at which you have to just say to business leaders, look, why are you depending on something that's so poor? Why don't you have people who can do this job well? I remember also interviewing Laszlo Bock, you know, who used to run HR at Google, and he said they would never use algorithms to do this for several reasons. One was they don't want to hire more people like they had 3 years ago, because 3 years isn't today.
And that's
And
the
they
thing,
don't, you know, and so they don't actually want to keep getting the same people, because the company itself has different needs and is confronting different challenges. So actually what they focused on much more was, how do we develop really great hiring and interviewing processes? And how do we look at who seems to be a really great hiring manager in terms of finding and hiring and retaining and developing great people? How do they do that? And how do we teach other people to do it? And that seems to me to be much more enlightened, because those people will adapt quickly to new needs and new issues in a way that the AI or the algorithms will simply assume that history keeps repeating itself, and it doesn't.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's still based on time, even if it learns. I'm seeing lots of things. There we go. Gonna just try and skim. So, and I think you almost covered Paul's comment around Google and their fallout with their AI ethics guru.
Well, you know, I mean, clearly Google has a whole heap of problems. And I mean, it's really interesting. You know, I read philosophy at university, and I'm kind of rather happy to see it. Philosophy is making a comeback, right?
Yes.
It's making a comeback because, as Mary Warnock once said to me, you know, philosophers have no subject of their own. So they're not territorial, but they're really useful everywhere. Please note all those people who think we should just study STEM subjects, right? I think, you know, Google's right to have an ethics committee. It has to understand, when you have an ethics committee, you have to pay attention to it, and you're not buying the people. And this is clearly where it came unstuck. It is there to ask hard questions, and management is there to be able to answer them. And I mean, we see exactly the same thing with Facebook. I think there's also, and I'm about the 5 millionth person to say this, It's just a huge issue with the scale of these companies and whether or not they are in fact manageable. Facebook, I think, clearly is not. I don't, I'm not sure whether Google is. But I would definitely say, new tech, old tech, some of the same rules apply. Don't lie, right?
Mhm.
Don't say, well, our workforce has this fabulous workforce of people in these fabulous buildings with all these great privileges, when about half your workforce is contract labor with none of those privileges. This is an age of transparency, good and ill, and people will find out. And it does nobody any good to try to, to improve their propaganda and their smoke screens. We just cut to the chase, do the right thing, and move on.
If anybody heard you out there, no, I'm sure they did. I know a couple of people on this will be taking note. I'm going to jump slightly. This is slightly more maybe practical of some kind. Paul is asking about, do you think that there's a problem with creating a case for investing in preparedness? Is that because it's hard to put a direct business outcome on it, so that plans sort of linked with business cases, they win the battle for capital and go on? And I had a question similar on that around, lots of companies that we talk to and we help kind of transition, they're wanting to future proof. Is that just, so this whole preparedness, future proofing?
They don't want to future proof. They just want, they want to eat cakes all day and not get fat. Right.
Yeah, that too.
Really want. Nobody can afford entirely to future proof their business. It would cost as much as the business. Let's be really clear about that.
Exactly.
What you have to do is to think about, what are the risks for my business which would have greatest impact and which are most likely? Because you cannot provide for all of the risks at every level of impact, and it would be absurd to do so. But where we have been poor decision makers is in not doing any. So the perfect story here is the story of the creation of the Center for Epidemic Preparedness.
Yes.
Where the director of the Wellcome Trust, who had worked in epidemics, in SARS, I think, and Ebola. And the Ebola 2015 outbreak was a really fundamental moment when, for the first time ever, in the middle of an epidemic, they had an untested vaccine that was worth trying in a real case. This had never happened before. They had been developing Ebola drugs, but then the epidemic would stop and they didn't have a cohort to test it on. Suddenly they had a drug ready to go and a cohort to test it on. And what did they discover? Wow, that's how you end epidemics. Right? Now, they always thought that, but they'd never lived through it. So he came back and he knew, as everybody in epidemics does know, epidemics are always with us. There's no profile of an epidemic. They're all different. So you can't predict them. You know they're going to happen. You don't know when, you don't know where they're going to start, and you don't know what the pathogen is going to be. But you do know that there are some small number of diseases with epidemic potential. And you know that were there to be a huge outbreak, that the consequence would be devastating. So likelihood and impact. And the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness was first launched to say, we have to start developing vaccines now. So not like Ebola, developing it, with over one Ebola outbreak and then stop, and another Ebola outbreak and then stop. Let's start now ahead of time, so that should any of these things break out on an epidemic scale, we are prepared. And they chose 6 diseases. Lassa, Nipah, chikungunya. I can't remember all of them. And they included coronaviruses. And the reason that we have been able to produce vaccines in historically fast times is because we didn't start in 2020. We started in 2017. Now, a couple of interesting footnotes to this story, right? I think the first, so Wellcome started it. It's one of the richest healthcare charities in the world. It got support from the Gates Foundation and then from the government of, I think, Norway and somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Britain didn't join the coalition until 2020. But it was a beautiful example of what preparedness looks like. Now, this afternoon, I was on the phone talking to a colleague of mine who's an expert in cybersecurity.
Yeah.
We know that cyber attacks are endemic. They're exactly like epidemics, right? You know they're going to happen. You know they're always happening. You don't know quite.
You don't know the shape
or when or where, right?
Yep.
We could design systems that were much, much more resilient, so they could recover faster. But nobody's spending the money. And the reason I think is that we still have, our minds are still absolutely held hostage by the notion of efficiency, which is we want to do everything bigger, faster, cheaper, better.
Yeah.
But we do not want to spend a moment or a penny on something that might never happen. And that's why we went into, in the UK, went into the pandemic with 84,000 job vacancies. It's now 90. And we had one of the lowest levels of critical care beds in all of Europe in terms of head of population, because we were being efficient. We had, I think, 87% occupancy of our critical care beds in normal times. What that means is 2 motorway pileups and you're done. But that's efficient. 87% occupancy. If you were a hotel, wow.
Yeah, that's what we want.
Great management. Get a Manager of the Year award. So it's in the nature of uncertainty that efficiency is going to rob you of margins of error, or what Mark Carney calls buffers. And there are areas of any business where impact is high and likelihood is high, where you have to spend on the buffers. And we don't like doing it because we have educated generations and generations of managers not to do it. And that's just got to change.
So I wanted, I was looking because I saw Terry and he must have jumped off because he's the head of Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, who suffered a very big cyber attack on Christmas Eve. And so he's been rebuilding their whole system after that, but I think he's jumped back off again. A follow-up question that links. So Greg Watson is asking, do you have a view on the use of sort of non-financial information like ESG by investors and the harnessing of AI-based unstructured data? Is this a positive way to overcome the simplistic models of orthodox finance and introduce impact into financial decisions, or is it just another form of oversimplifying?
Well, all of us oversimplify. I think, my concern about automating decision-making is it allows us to scale error at a phenomenal speed and scale. So that's the problem. If I make a mistake, the consequence of it is not as great as if the whole system is producing this mistake. I mean, I definitely think that there is a necessary opportunity to integrate soft data and hard data. It's one of the reasons I'm a fan of scenario planning, because that's specifically what it was designed to do. And there's a very brilliant article out this week by the mathematician Hannah Fry in the New Yorker, looking at the limitations of numbers. And the degree to which, we have, again, we've grown up with, because economics ate our brains, right, for the last 30 years. We grew
That's
up
the
with
quote.
the belief that everything that mattered could be measured, although it's clearly
Yes.
not true. And anyway, it's a wonderful example of how the numbers will tell you something. They may tell you something wrong. They'll definitely tell you something incomplete. So I think being able in our minds to integrate hard data and soft data is really important. Pierre Wack, who's generally regarded as a sort of founding father of scenario planning, was a very, very tough critic of building computer models for this kind of work. He regarded it as the enemy of thought, which is actually, you have to internalize this information. You have to imagine how it plays out. Human beings are fantastic at doing this. And I don't see a reason to adopt very untested, very dangerous technology to do something we're very, very good at. And I think in the context of ESG, even more so, because the whole argument for ESG is about the consequences for the world of this kind of investment.
Mm.
So I think, everybody's jumping on the AI bandwagon. Everybody's thinking, oh God, thank goodness I can give up thinking and just outsource it. And they're wrong, and they know they're wrong. But they have these people coming and selling them stuff that is really exciting. And I'm not saying don't ever use it. I chair a company where we're going to be using it a little tiny, tiny bit, because it's simply going to allow us to do something we do already more comprehensively and faster. But it isn't about judgment. It's just about finding information. It's not deciding about that information. So I think, there are areas in which it's a great deal less dangerous than others. But I am aghast. I mean, you can tell, right?
Yes.
At the willingness with which we just give up on ourselves.
Yeah.
Because I think long term, what that means, if institutions do that, I think then their legitimacy comes into question. If they aren't clearly connected to and serving the society in which they operate, do they have a license to operate? And if so, why? For a company or an organization to become so remote from the world it inhabits, I think is intrinsically a very dangerous thing for the company and for the society that it inhabits.
Have we not bought into the fact that actually we are connected through big data, I want to say, and that as a company we can say, no, we're doing AI because it's based on more data that we could know. So actually we're better informed, the decisions are better. That would be the argument, right?
Yeah, and I mean, up to a point, that's true. Okay, you can now use satellite data to see how many cars are in supermarket parking.
Yeah.
It's quite useful. I mean, I also think, we made this program about decision making.
Yes.
I think, and I feel this very much sitting on boards. The minute somebody calls for more data, I think, okay, everybody's out of their depth. Right? They think more data is going to give them some, and it's very rare that that's true. It's usually an alibi for, I don't know what to do. Let's kick it into the long grass and ask for more data. I've seen this a million times. And very interesting, that somebody like Eliza Manningham-Buller will say, look, the data is always incomplete, right? The longer you wait for more data, the fewer options you have. And you think, oh, it'll give me more options when I have more information. It, by and large, will not do that. It will reduce your options because you're running out of time. And so I think generally, not every time, of course, but generally when I hear people saying we need more data, what they're really saying is, I don't understand the data in front of me. I'm afraid to say so. So I'm going to cover my ass by asking for more.
That's a good reminder. I'm going to jump. Zand has asked a question. He's curious whether you've come across people, places, collaborations that are working on creating the conditions in which curiosity, imagination, learning from mistakes, courage, and all those things in your book, really, courage to take the risk and asking questions, are being systematically cultivated and leveraged as capabilities.
And I mean, that's pretty much what, most of my book, A Bigger Prize, is about. Yeah. I mean, it is both a formal critique of competition as a presiding principle, but in order that it not just be a head-banging book, right? It is also a counterblast saying, look at these highly collaborative environments and what they're capable of producing. And look at how they solve incredibly hard problems and how the rate at which they innovate. That's because of the kind of curiosity and freedom that is deliberately fostered and supported within these organizations. And there are quite a few examples like that in Uncharted also. But that was really the kind of focal point of my work in A Bigger Prize, which I have to say, I think was a rather overlooked book, because at the time that it came out, I think the notion that competition wasn't good for you was heresy. And I like to think I've proved my case hands down now. But it was, I mean, it's like many of the books I've written, it was way before it was fashionable to say so. And people just, even if they liked the idea, they couldn't quite
say it. Well, I'll admit that's the one I haven't read.
Oh, there you go.
So that exactly. Right, we're getting around. I'm trying to pick up on everyone's messages. So Ifshata is saying, what do you think on how the best way to nurture the next generation of entrepreneurs? Too many are following the technology trends, the unicorn valuations. How do they build in the transparency as they scale? How do we nurture them?
Yeah, great question. And I work a lot with, at the university, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs because I love working with young people. I think they're much more optimistic than is rational, which I love. And they have a real appetite for solving problems. And I'm very interested that more of them than ever want to solve problems in a socially beneficial way. So on the one hand, yes, it's true, you have a lot of kind of copycat, unimaginative, let's just go for the money. What is it? Boris Johnson called it capitalism and greed. Yeah, it's
greed. Oh, yeah.
It's still flourishing. And actually, it actually, what's really interesting, it's not driving innovation. It's driving really crippled innovation, which is, how can I do something like Uber? How can I do something like Deliveroo? How can I actually not innovate, but reap the rewards for it? But I would say that a lot of our university students and their generation are extremely focused on producing companies that are sustainable financially. So they are commercial, profitable businesses, but they also want them to deliver a beneficial social impact from the get-go, not as some extra add-on later. And so I think that how to nurture them is really about being a friendly critic. So I would say that of the hundreds of, entrepreneurial contests and business plans that I've judged, they generally always fall down on two fronts. One is they spend too much time on the Excel spreadsheet because that gives them comfort. And the numbers might be right in terms of, margins and stuff like that. The timeline's always wrong. Always, 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 always. It always takes longer than you think. The overnight success takes years. So that's the first thing. I mean, so try to get realistic about that, because it has huge consequences, not just in terms of funding, but in terms of human stamina. That it's going to be a long run. I think and therefore help them to learn how to nurture each other. Because I mean, some of my greatest work experiences have been with startups, not because it was the easiest work, but because it was the hardest, with people who absolutely supported each other, phenomenal solidarity and diversity and so on. So nurture them in that way. I think the other problem I always see is build it and they will come mentality.
Yeah.
And I always talk about this, and I always talk about how, however fantastic the idea, the product, or the service, they will not come if they don't know about it. And online advertising is not the answer. I mean, it's important and it's worth doing. I'm not saying don't do it.
No, but so many people think it's the holy grail.
It's not enough. So you have to think about adjacencies. You have to think about partnerships. You have to think strategically. And that's I mean, I don't know how to teach that well enough that I'm not seeing that problem anymore.
Yeah, let us know.
I keep kind of trying to come at it from different angles, but those are the two kind of problem areas I find. And the more we can help people on those problems, I think the more likely they are to be successful faster.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. I'm wary of time. I'm just trying to make sure we're getting through all these questions. There's one from Isaac from a little while ago, actually, that you are talking of sort of an alternate world order of high degree of freedom, which is competing with another sort of new world order, which is seeking to limit degrees of freedom. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Do you see these two?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that, on the one hand, I think there's a very large cohort of people very focused on humanitarian values, very focused on social justice, very focused on society, democracy, legitimacy, and a countervailing trend which wants to get rid of all that, thinks it's messy and ugly and pointless, and it allows weak people to survive and all sorts of stuff. These are the people who believe in selection. These are people who believe in eugenics. These are people who think, as Margaret Thatcher did, that you only need a handful of people really to drive a society. So yeah, I think that's kind of the mess we're in right now.
And I'm reminded of a young entrepreneur who said to me not that long ago, said, well, surely if we're advising businesses to do the right thing, they'll be losing out, because there is a time right now, which is that if you just follow the rules rather than go beyond them, because the rules are at the floor at the moment in terms of ESG and so on, you could still make an awful lot of money before sort of everything catches up with you. How do you know exactly? I just want to hear, how do we shift those types of people again? Oh, and thank you for the Hannah Fry article.
Maybe you will, maybe you won't. I mean, personally, I guess my response to that is, if they have children, money isn't going to save them from climate change. If there's no food, I mean, okay, maybe they're going to be bigger thugs on the black market, but it's not going to be fun to be, right? No. Living in a world where people are starving in their millions, where you have millions of people displaced, where you can't count on a food supply, where social order starts to break down, no amount of money is going to turn that into a lovely place to be. We have people talking a lot about happiness and how we should all be happy. How are people going to be happy when everybody in the world is miserable? Seriously, unless they're in some drug-induced psychopathic state. So yes, I absolutely accept there are thugs out there who just think, maybe we've got another 10 years before this stuff really comes home to roost. So let's live it up. And I'm sure they will. But doesn't excite me.
No, and actually, I'm an eternal optimist, and I think, well, this crisis actually, even though some of them have managed to dodge it, will, you know, will make you live better through uncertainty, and it has brought it closer, hopefully, to everyone across the board. We are now at time. There was one question from John that I didn't want to not ask, partly because he's going to give me a hard time tomorrow otherwise, but which was, if you are choosing a fourth career after your very well-deserved G&T, what would it be?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I have recently become a parish councillor for my very tiny village where I live.
Wow.
Because I didn't want to just be somebody who, kind of lived here. And I'm enjoying that a lot more than I perhaps thought I might. So I guess I might become a grassroots activist.
Oh, I love that. We'll see you in the placard.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just one thing in response to the previous question. I'm writing an essay at the moment about the von Donnersmarck film, Never Look Away.
Yes.
And there's a very interesting feature in that. I mean, it's a very fascinating film. But von Donnersmarck says, somebody asked him about, well, the bad people in your film aren't punished. And he said, no, they're not punished, but they don't have any access to the good things in life. They don't, so they can live well enough and they can travel and stuff, but they don't have any friends. They don't have any relationships of trust. They don't have any base. They don't have any home. He said, really, this is how people are punished. Yeah. Which is it's not by guillotines. It's that they can't access the things that make life worthwhile.
And you've given me a perfect segue actually into, because this is a reminder of my philosophy degree, and the Greeks, for all their flaws, on the good life is led by the good man. On that note,
we'll all retire.
On that note, gin and tonic will retire. Thank you so much. I don't know if you can see there's so many lovely comments.
Thank you to everybody. Chat. Thank you to everybody for coming. It's a wonderful conversation.
Thank you all. You are welcome to switch your mutes off and sort of say goodbye in your own language, because there are a few different languages here, I know, if you want to.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Margaret.